Pueblo in so many ways represents the cultural richness of Colorado as a crossing point, as an international boundary. It's drawn people together from very diverse perspectives over time.
I can't imagine when a train pulled in with new immigrants and they got off in this area, what it must have been like for them.
Our history is how we have united despite all the reasons to be divided. We have found a way to find common purpose.
American Indians, Hispanos, explorers, soldiers, farmers, miners, railroad men have all come to this spot, have all called it home, and have all had to work together in order to succeed.
Colorado Experience is a co-production of Rocky Mountain PBS and History Colorado.
History Colorado brings history to life for audiences of all ages. Through exhibits, collections, and historic preservation programs throughout the state, History Colorado connects people to the stories, places, and heritage of Colorado's past that provide perspectives on today and inspire our choices for tomorrow. Find out more at www.historycolorado.org. Additional funding provided by El Pomar Foundation and the Betcher Foundation, celebrating 75 years of philanthropy in Colorado.
With additional funding and support from these fine organizations. And from viewers like you, thank you.
History is really complicated. All history is really complicated. There are so many things that run through it. There's race, there's class, there's gender, there's politics. And I think Pueblo can be sliced and diced in so many different ways. Those fault lines run in so many different directions that if any one of those fault lines dominated the history of this town, nothing would ever get done.
Well, if we're going to go back to the beginning, of course we have to go thousands of years, but the primary tribes really for this region are five. There's the Arapaho, Cheyenne, Apache, Comanche, and the Utes. The Utes probably being the oldest tribe in the area.
For thousands of years, Pueblo has been a crossroads for many different people. It sits across one of the oldest migration corridors in North America, and for more than 10,000 years, people have been moving north and south across the Front Range and across the Arkansas River, right at the spot where Pueblo was built.
What we know as I-25 today is an ancient trade route of Native Americans that extends all the way, like the current road does. You follow I-25 once it crosses the Mexican border, goes straight to Mexico City. Even in the pre-white man times, if you will, pre-European times, Indians did conflict with each other. Europeans did not introduce conflict, warfare, trade. It had already existed here in Pueblo, and Pueblo is almost a crossroads. And according to many accounts, maybe the first expedition that entered what is now Colorado would have been the Coronado expedition from 1540 to 42. Many of them brought their wives and children. Some of them quickly intermixed with the Indian women. Some of them married them, some of them just cohabitated, but there was definite cross-pollination.
We have a border culture here. The border being the Arkansas River, it flows right through our town. And so that separated countries. When those five tribes were moving through here, that was not seen as a border. It wasn't until the French came in and the Spanish came in, then they started looking at the vast territory and claiming it. And it went back and forth between France and Spain a few times.
And most of the Indians, particularly the nomadic Indians, they refused to submit to Spanish authority, and there was almost a constant state of warfare.
For instance, the Comanches were here, definitely, but when the Spanish came through, they moved them south because they were constantly raiding the colonies. They were a real threat to the settlement of northern New Mexico. So Juan Bautista de Anza pushed the Comanches south in the 1700s, just a few years after the American Revolution. So that kind of gives you an idea of just how old our history is here.
Pueblo was an international boundary. The Arkansas River was literally the boundary between New Spain and French Louisiana. In 1803, the French sold their portion of the North American continent to the United States as part of the Louisiana Purchase. And so Pueblo and the Arkansas River became the major border crossing in the far west between the United States and New Spain, and then after 1821, Mexico.
Mexico becomes independent from Spain in 1821. By 1822, there's already people coming from Missouri overland and establishing the Santa Fe Trail, establishing a trade route.
By 1842, a group of traders, some of whom had been affiliated with Bensold Fort, established their own trading post called El Pueblo at the site of today's Pueblo. El Pueblo means the village in Spanish, and it was a settlement of mountain men and Hispanos and American Indians who all lived together. They raised livestock, and they traded with each other and with American Indians for hides and for robes and for whiskey and guns and beads. And it was a place where people could come together and exchange things that they had for things that they needed.
American historians, Frederick Jackson Turner, in his Pulitzer Prize winning essay back in the 1890s, talked about the passing of the American frontier. And he looks at these mountain men, these traders, fur trappers and frontiersmen as literally carrying American culture with them, spreading west to the Pacific coast, what would later be referred to as manifest destiny.
They believed that it was America's destiny to occupy all of North America from the Atlantic to the Pacific. They felt in the long run, having northern Mexico as part of the United States would spread what they called an empire of liberty, that we would bring American systems, political systems like democracy, to people who the traders very often felt were backwards.
Pueblo's history is very complex. When we're speaking about all of the tribal nations, and then we have the countries that claim this area as well, including the Republic of Texas came up to this border at one point. So we're talking about a lot of flags flying over this area.
The Mexican-American War of 1846 to 1848 brought a lot of turmoil to the region around Pueblo. The Hispanos who lived at a place like Pueblo were nationals of the Republic of Mexico, but they were very often married to Americans or to American Indians. The various nationalities of the people who lived there led to all kinds of discussions about loyalty and citizenship. Ultimately, by the end of the Mexican-American War, all of New Mexico became part of the United States, and the land south of the Arkansas River became American soil. Relationships between the United States government and the Plains Indian tribes were really deteriorating. The arrival of the United States Army scared away game, it spread disease, it led to the decline of timber and water resources, which convinced the American Indians that they really didn't want to stay in the area anymore. The war actually brought a decline to fur trading posts like El Pueblo and Bent's Fort, and by the end of the 1840s, that era of the Indian trade and the Santa Fe trade was really over. The Americans began taking up more land, and that in turn created resentment among many American Indian tribes.
After the Mexican-American War, treaties were made with the tribes in the area, and a treaty was made with the Utes. They settled on specified land, and they were a very peaceful tribe. They maintained this treaty. In turn, the United States agreed to build forts that would protect them as long as the white man could move through their territory freely. But after many years, they became poorer and poorer, where the other tribes were becoming more affluent. Comanches, Kiowas, and other tribes were given annuities that included ammunition and guns. So they raided the Utes, and the Utes were starving. They were not given provisions. They were not given those implements. They were not taught how to be farmers. The tribes were pitted against each other. Leaders asked for ammunition and powder so that they could protect themselves from the raiding tribes, and that never came. It never came. And so that's why they became so poor and so desperate. They were starving. They eventually tried to meet with the territorial governor, Meriwether. He had gifted them some jackets, some coats that were military-like with lapels and very attractive. But unfortunately, from that meeting, the natives contracted smallpox, and that was the last straw.
It might shock some of our sensibilities today, and a lot of people consider it kidnapping and slavery and theft. But it was a different world, and customs were very different from the way we think of laws, what should be right and wrong. So it wasn't the bloodthirsty savages scalping, raping, pillaging, wanton bloodlust. That's a gross exaggeration of a very old tradition.
A new leader emerges. His name is Tierra Blanca, White Earth, and they start to raid. They came to Felipe Vaca's Placita, and he had a number of cabins and workers. He had quite a crop of corn and a large number of horses, livestock, and the Utes raided there. They took his animals, his horses, and then they proceeded west to the trading post. In a short order, they heard the screams, hollering and shooting coming from the trading post. After a while, when things were quiet, they investigated, and they found the residents murdered.
The attack took place on Christmas Day. Most of the residents of the fort at Pueblo had been up all night celebrating Christmas Eve. They were totally unprepared for the attack. When the Utes arrived, they killed almost everybody in the fort. They only captured one woman and two children and used them as hostages. And it was a real tragedy. It spread a lot of alarm among the settlers of southern Colorado. And ultimately it led to the establishment of Fort Massachusetts and then Fort Garland in the San Luis Valley, an American military post that would keep the peace between settlers and American Indians. It took a number of years after the massacre for people to settle again in the Pueblo region. The cause of the next wave of settlement was the Pikes Peak Gold Rush of 1859 and 1860. Pueblo was always a border and a border crossing, and for the thousands of gold seekers making their way to the gold fields of Cherry Creek and the Rocky Mountains, Pueblo was a natural place to stop and resupply. It was a place where you could rest up before that last jump into the Rocky Mountains. There were a number of little settlements that were founded right around Pueblo that ultimately consolidated into the city of Pueblo as we know it. First, it was a farming supply town and a ranching supply town, providing goods to the miners. By the 1870s, it became a major railroad town, once again serving that purpose as a crossroads in southern Colorado. The arrival of the Denver and Rio Grande Railroad really caused Pueblo to boom. For the first time, it was an urban and industrial area, and because of its proximity to large coal fields, it seemed like the ideal place for railroad developers to build their rails, to provide the coal that would power their engines across the plains and into the mountains. So developers like William Jackson Palmer, the founder of the Denver Rio Grande Railroad, made a beeline for Pueblo.
General Palmer was the first industrialist. And he started the land companies here to bring people to the west. Well, how are you going to get people to the west? You needed railroads. And he realized with the resources here that he could make the rails here. We could make the rails.
Between 1870 and 1880, you saw the arrival of the Denver and Rio Grande and the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe, and the Rock Island Railroad, and the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy, all of these railroad lines converging on Pueblo as the hub of southern Colorado, sort of that nexus between the mountains and the plains.
Thousands upon thousands of people came out on those very rails, and they came to Pueblo's Union Depot. Pueblo, at its height, had 55 trains coming and going a day. There were different languages spoken here all the time.
By the 1890s, Pueblo was a jungle of factories and smokestacks, billowing huge plumes of smoke into the atmosphere. Of course, you need a lot of laborers in order to keep that industry humming, and Pueblo imported thousands of workers literally from all over the world, from Europe and Latin America and Asia, who all came to Pueblo in order to get a job, in order to escape difficult circumstances at home and hopefully get a new life in America.
It is a city with a tremendous racial and ethnic mix, and has been for a very, very long time. A lot of people who worked in the coal mines, back when the coal mines were operating, when the coal mines stopped operating, moved to Pueblo and got other jobs. So if you talk to native Puebloans, it's like my dad worked in the steel mill. Well, my grandpa worked in the coal mines, and they all sort of come together. The whole southern Colorado, what used to be industrial southern Colorado, comes together in this city. I think that makes its character unique. We're not just in Colorado, really in the entire West.
By the 1880s, steel companies like the Colorado Coal and Iron Company and its successor, the Colorado Fuel and Iron Company, made Pueblo their corporate headquarters, manufacturing gigantic foundries and factories to smelt pig iron into steel and manufacture that steel into rails and the other sinews of the Industrial Revolution.
CF&I was the largest steel mill west of the Mississippi River, and CF&I was the largest private employer in Colorado, the largest private landowner. In addition to the steel mill, the coal mines were very profitable for the company, because the coal mines not only provided coal for the steelmaking industry, but here in Pueblo, but they also provided coal for residential and commercial fuel purposes. So that's the fuel in the Colorado Fuel and Iron Company.
Prior to the unions, the workers were not regarded, not their safety, not their wives, not their children. They were pitted against each other, and they were not assisted. They did not have any medical help. There were no benefits, and they were extremely exploited. And the work was incredibly dangerous. Certainly, the coal wars, the strikes affected positively workers' rights. And with the Ludlow strike and the Rockefeller plan, that had an impact on workers throughout the country, and still does. We definitely have a union history here in Pueblo.
CF&I had a sociological department, and the purpose of the sociological department in a lot of ways was to educate the immigrants about American customs and American activities.
They see themselves as assisting these individuals and these immigrant groups, even though you're dealing with Mexican Americans or these Nuevo Mexicanos who are actually from southern Colorado and northern New Mexico for a long time. But this idea of we can help uplift you, it's kind of ideas connected with the progressive movement. I think CF&I is actually saying, we don't want you to identify as ethnic groups, we want you to identify as workers. And their sociological department is headed by Richard Corwin, who actually is the pioneer of Pueblo's medicine, right? And so one of the things that he addresses is, one of the sociological ideas is to Americanize these immigrant groups. And I actually think of it as more as, it's not about Americanization at the beginning, it's how do we make better employees, and then it becomes Americanization.
Colorado Fuel and Iron is one of the premier welfare capitalists in the United States. A welfare capitalist is a company that does things not because they have to for labor market purposes. They do so because they want to, thinking that it will get them some sort of advantage in the long run. Baseball teams, that's part of welfare capitalism. Having company gardens is part of welfare capitalism. None of this is required if you're going to make steel, but they wanted their workers to be happy workers, and they thought doing these things would pay off in the long run because of productivity.
CF&I clearly drove the economy of Pueblo and the economy of the entire state of Colorado for many, many years. 121 years CF&I was in place. There were booms and busts, and throughout that 121-year history, But it's very, very difficult to find anybody in Pueblo who didn't either work at the plant or know somebody who worked there.
Well, Pueblo thrived, and so with that comes this well-to-do metropolitan town, not very large, but certainly by Western standards, Pueblo was quite sophisticated, and there was a building boom, and beautiful avenues were built, beautiful homes on the north side. The first neighborhoods were built by the very people who were the industrialists and the railroaders. There would be beautiful shops and restaurants and banks. The newspaper is well established here. Life was very good, but unfortunately, the summer of 1921, after a drought, it began to rain, and it rained quite heavily for 3 days. The levees broke. The water rose very, very quickly, so a lot of people were trapped. Train cars picked up and moved and smashed into the beautiful shops. There was a fire that started in the lumber yard, and so we had burning rafts on the fire. It had to be an incredible night of terror.
During the flood of 1921, telephone operators, women who worked for the Pueblo telephone system, were among the first to learn about the flood, and they spent their rotation calling people down the Arkansas River, warning them that the flood was coming. They stayed at their posts so long that they actually were unable to leave because the bottom floor of the telephone building was underwater in the flood. And they actually had to walk across a boardwalk, a piece of plank laid across the roof of their building to a neighboring hotel in order to receive help and shelter.
There were about 250 souls lost. It took days before relief could come, and the center of Pueblo was completely wiped out. Fortunately, most of the structures survived, and so we still have those same buildings today, but the merchants were wiped out. Pueblo suffered a huge blow, and it took a long time to pull out of that. So that was one of the first economic blows to hit Pueblo.
We were talking about how all of Colorado history seems to disappear in the textbooks after 1935. That's a sign on one hand that it's better, but at the same time there are actually 5 strikes in the steel mill after 1945. But those strikes are national in nature, they're not local in nature. The struggles just change and they morph, and eventually I think the town has to pull together to survive, despite whatever tensions there might be with respect to race or with respect to ethnicity.
In the 1970s, the decline of steel production in the United States, you'll also see a decline in production at CF&I. And so the result of this is that CF&I's production will be cut, but then also their employment will be cut. And so individuals who, for generations, their family members had worked at the mill and had just been kind of part of familial culture that when they graduated from high school, they'd go and work in the mill. CF&I would provide them with pensions, workman's compensation, health insurance, other things like that they no longer have access to.
When CF&I finally went under, it was devastating to a lot of families because the steel mill was this city.
Pueblo, in a lot of ways, is still kind of recovering from that and trying to figure out where are they going to put, where is their base of manufacturing? Because the steel mill had been their base of manufacturing for almost 100 years. And so I think we're still dealing with that issue. Is it in wind energy? Is it in solar energy? Where do we put our employment at?
I always like to look on the positive side, and I think the diversity and the cooperation is there. You can't ignore the conflicts that have occurred, but you take the good with the bad.
So many Coloradans trace their ancestry to people who came to work in the factories and foundries and stockyards of Pueblo. It was the place where thousands of people got their start in Colorado.
If you walk around downtown Pueblo, if you go down Union Avenue, the thing to do is not to look in front of you. You need to look up, because that's where you can get an idea of what these buildings used to be, who built them, who put them up. You can see etched in stone, for instance, the names of people who used to own the building, or you can see etched in stone the names of businesses that used to operate there.
We have great plans, big vision, and have already begun to change the infrastructure, the center of Pueblo. Our river walk is still to be completed. 3 more phases will come in over the next 15 years.
Pueblo still maintains a really cosmopolitan spirit. Descendants of those original steel workers or rail workers are still the people who make Pueblo a lively place today. You can still find Italian and Greek communities, Hispanic communities, African American communities, Asian communities, the people who've always called Pueblo home for generations now.
People of Pueblo are hardworking, they serve their country. We do have 4 Congressional Medal of Honor winners, but I think that they represent many of the men and women from Pueblo who have served in World War I, World War II, Korea, Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan. And I think that when you actually start talking to people in our community, besides just the Congressional Medal of Honor winners, is that it's everyday men and women who served. And I think it's something that historically, when their ancestors came to Pueblo, people came to Pueblo to work. They came to work in the coal mines, they came to work in the steel mills, and this is some of the most dangerous labor even today.
Pueblo is trying to do a better job of sharing our heritage and all of these stories and just how old our history is. We're doing a better job of telling those stories with our museums and programs. I think people will be very wise to take a second look and to keep their eye on Pueblo, because we're not done yet. We're not done yet. We're still making history, and there's still a lot of stories in the making.
Colorado Experience is a co-production of Rocky Mountain PBS and History Colorado.
History Colorado brings history to life for audiences of all ages. Through exhibits, collections, and historic preservation programs throughout the state, History Colorado connects people to the stories, places, and heritage of Colorado's past that provide perspectives on today and inspire our choices for tomorrow. Find out more at www.historycolorado.org. Additional funding provided by El Pomar Foundation and the Betcher Foundation, celebrating 75 years of philanthropy in Colorado.
With additional funding and support from these fine organizations. And from viewers like you, thank you. This episode is available on Blu-ray. Visit our website to order. There's more Colorado Experience online at rmpbs.org/Colorado Experience, Facebook and Twitter.